Okay, so tonight it's going to be Alyssa and I presenting this. So Alyssa is the president of Victorian Kangaroo Alliance, and I'm the Advocacy Manager for Engage.Vic. So we're going to be taking it in turns, talking you through this, and also answering any questions at the end, and also we'll make ourselves available to answer questions by email, etc. after this. So this is our agenda for tonight. So we're just going to give you a bit of an intro and some background to the Kangaroo Harvest Management Program, talk through what this consultation is, the terms of reference, the objectives that they're going to be looking at, how to navigate the whole process, because it's not straightforward. Then we're going to go through some discussion points and things that you can actually include in your responses, and then take questions from everybody. I'm just going to throw to Alyssa. Sorry, to give you the background and introduce what this program actually is.
Yeah, okie dokie. So, sorry, I'm just going to expand this. What have I done? Alrighty, so the Kangaroo Harvest Management Plan, that's essentially, so they've made it very confusing, because the program that we all know about is the commercial killing program, which is the kangaroo harvesting program. And this review isn't specifically looking at the KHP. So the actual killing is looking at the plan that guides and authorises the killing. And so they made it a bit confusing. And like, even when I asked them and I said, you know, why are you not allowing people to do long form submissions so they can talk about the impact of the KHP? They said, well, it's not about the KHP, it's about the plan. And it's like, well, they're very interlinked. But the way that I like to look at it is that the Kangaroo Harvest Management Plan, so the KHMP, that's like the leash. And the KHP, the actual killing, is like the dog. And then the government is holding the leash and walking the dog using the leash. So it guides it. It is the authorising document. It's the reason why we have it. So it is really important. And so just for some background, in the state, we have kangaroos killed for many different reasons. Number one is colonialism, of course, because since, you know, Westerners arrived here, they didn't want to live with kangaroos. So they've been systematically killing them off ever since. We started off in Victoria. For the most part of Victorian history, we've just had this authority to control wildlife system, which is, we call it ATCW. And so that's essentially what's known as culling. So a landholder has a problem or a perceived problem, says, I've got too many kangaroos on my property and I want to kill them. And then the government says, oh, okay, you've tried such and such, can be basically nothing. Yes, you can kill these kangaroos. And that was really widespread, the persecution of kangaroos under that system, by far the worst out of any other wildlife. And so under a lot of pressure, the government created the commercial system under what was called the Kangaroo Pet Food Trial. And that was started back in 2014. And the idea of that was to reduce waste from all these kangaroos being shot under permits. But what we actually saw there was that the Kangaroo Pet Food Trial massively increased the number of kangaroos being killed, and that it was lawless and corrupt and a threat to sustainability. And it said all of this. It said that it may actually have increased waste. And this all came out of a government review from the government's own department. But the government ignored it and instead actually expanded it across the whole state, removes the need for landholder permits at all, so you don't have to prove that you have any issues whatsoever with kangaroos. You can just book a shooter over the Service Victoria app in 3 minutes. And that is now what's known as the Kangaroo Harvesting Program. And so since 2014, when the commercial incentive was introduced, average quotas are now more than triple what they were at the time prior to commercialisation. So it's an absolute myth that it's there to reduce waste. It's purely a money-making venture. And yeah, and that sort of leads us to where we are now, where they have to have this Kangaroo Harvest Management Plan to feed into the Wildlife Act and to feed into the national government to get approval for our commercial program. So it's an important opportunity to try and make that as difficult as possible for them and really show a lot of negative community sentiment towards it, which is where it comes into the fact that they've made it really hard and really prescriptive to do the survey. But the most important thing is that we just get out there that people don't like this. They don't like the consequence of it, which is this mass commercialization, which is part of the world's largest land-based wildlife trade. I think that covers everything, doesn't it, Nat?
It does. Good explanation. I find that all the different ways that you can actually kill kangaroos are not only horrible, but they make it very, very confusing because they just keep coming up with more and more different ways you can. But you explained it very well.
Yeah. Oh, I should add as well that that's, of course, you know, in addition to all the other forms of mortality that kangaroos face, you know, things like road strike, fence entanglement. They get a huge number of them get killed by foxes when they're emergent joeys, which is a little known fact. Dogs, disease, introduced grasses that are toxic to them. There's all sorts of things. So kangaroos are really up against it. Cool.
Thanks. So this consultation is looking at 7 different objectives, which they're claiming are the objectives of the plan. And it's basically going to be looking at how well they achieve these objectives, which, you know, from our point of view is obviously not at all. But the only good thing about them is that by being quite broad, it does give you quite a bit of scope to talk about various different things that you don't like about the system. So the first objective is how sustainable this plan is. The second one is how humane and how well they're paying attention to animal welfare. The third one is about how it's regulated, how appropriately the regulation occurs. The fourth one is about monitoring and the compliance that's done by authorities to keep an eye on this program. The fifth objective is adaptive management and research opportunities that the plan presents. Their sixth objective is to maintain openness, accountability and transparency. So this is about how it fits into the community values and how it fits in with you know, with societal values. And the seventh objective is to work with traditional owners to provide opportunities for their participation in the program. So pretty much anything that you'll think of along the way that you'd like to say will fit under one of those, hopefully. So moving on to the how do you actually get to give feedback on this plan? So they've actually created a survey format, which no one is very happy about. We've a number of us, like individually and as organisations, have contacted them and said, will they accept a written submission like we would normally produce for any of these consultations? And the answer has been a resounding no. Even when we've said we'll follow your questions, like we'll follow the questions in order, but it's just much easier to put it into one document, and it's still, the answer is no. They've also said no extensions. So the entire time frame from start to finish has been only 3 weeks. And usually most of these things, they'll give you an extension of a couple of days or a week. But again, resounding no. So if you're getting the theme here, it's that basically they don't actually really want your feedback. You know, they're looking at this whole consultation as just being a tick and flick exercise, like they're required to do a consultation, they're required to seek public feedback. Really, they're hoping that no one actually gives any feedback. So I don't know about you, but that just makes me even more determined to make sure that not only do I give them feedback, but that as many people as I know give them feedback, and say, obviously, that we don't want this program and we don't like it and it doesn't match what we think is acceptable behaviour towards kangaroos. They've also made it clear in there that they're not actually going to consider the ATCWs, the discrepancies in the Wildlife Act and the wildlife regs, and as Alyssa pointed out, the actual KHP. So again, they're sort of trying to restrict you in what you can actually talk about. And again, the reason for this is by making it like you can talk about you can talk about a broad range of issues about this plan, but a lot of the things that we might normally want to talk about, like saying that there are already kangaroos being killed under all these other programs, that the legislation is rubbish for protecting them. If you are talking about this stuff, they're basically just going to ignore it. So they've made it very clear that they have sort of that's not the framework that they're looking at. And as much as that's frustrating, we do need to work within that framework, because if you're here, obviously you care about kangaroos, and obviously you want to stand up for them and have your say. And so we want what you say to have as much impact as possible. So there are a variety of ways you can respond on there, depending on how much time you have. I guess, if you don't have a lot of time, you could basically go through and just do the tick boxes. Give you a hint, you pretty much want to say no to every single tick box, because it's all about saying, have we achieved this? Have we done a good job of this? No. So you could pretty much just tick no to every single tick box. And just at the general comment in section 1, just make a general comment along the lines of, I don't support the commercial killing industry, and I don't believe it's possible to conduct it in a humane way. Like, if you're really poor on time, you could do that. That'll take you less than 5 minutes to do that, and put in your name and address, name and email at the end. And that will count as a response saying that you are against this program. Obviously, we hope that you're going to put in a little bit more time than that. But at the end of the day, if that's all you can do, it's always better to do that rather than to do nothing, because that will still count as a vote against it. We have prepared a guide, which is, Alyssa's put that up on VKA socials. It's on AJP socials. If you look at the guide initially, you're going to see that it's long, and I get that, and that may look a little bit daunting as well. But the reason is that we've tried to put in a variety of potential responses for each of those spots where you can actually write a response, in the hopes that we don't double up, because we don't want you to just copy and paste. When they get these, what we call like cookie cutter responses, where they all look the same, they basically count them as one. And realistically, you've wasted your time. So we hope that you'll, look at the 7 potential options for what you could write about, pick the one that sort of stands out for you, and just sort of reword it in your own words and include that. And I know sometimes that, can feel a little bit like annoying to do, but honestly, it just has so much more impact than copy and pasting. And that's what we're really after here is, kangaroos can't speak up for themselves. They need us to do it for them. And so I think you can really go, like, in 20 minutes, you could go through and put in a couple of comments, general and about each objective, and submit it. Obviously you could spend longer, but you could put in a meaningful response in 20 minutes. So that's not, a massive amount of time. There's also in the way that we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but the way that you need to be responding along the way is the plan itself, if you read it on the Engage website, is divided up into requirements. So there's the objectives, and then it's looking at what are the requirements that help them meet these objectives, and then what are the targets that demonstrate that they have met these objectives. And so it's not asking you just to say what's rubbish about their requirements or what's rubbish about their targets. It's asking you to say, where are the gaps in their requirements and where are the gaps in their targets? And so again, you've got to be kind of careful in how you word things, again, because if you just put in that you're not, that you don't like or you don't agree with their targets or their requirements, then again, it's not really going to get counted because you're not fitting into their framework. And I'm sorry if this is all sounding a little bit confusing, but again, that's what it comes down to. They have not made this straightforward because they really don't want people to comment. But hopefully as we work through it and as we go through the different objectives, you'll be able to see exactly how you can make these responses. So this is just kind of breaking down what it actually looks like. So to get on and actually give a response, it's on the Engage.Vic website. So the easiest way is literally just Google Engage.Vic, and I know it's about the second row down. You'll see, you'll see that the KHMP is there. You will need to create a login. So many of you will have already got a login because you will have done other submissions, but you will need to create a login. The first question is going to ask you to rank those 7 objectives. We're suggesting that you actually skip that question. It's not a requirement to do that question. And the problem with doing it is that all of those things are important. So if you select one over the others, it gives them the ability at the end to say, well, only 30% of respondents considered welfare to be of utmost importance, that sort of thing. So it does give them the ability to kind of use those stats in a way that we're not really keen on. But it is entirely up to you. That's just, that's just our recommendation. Section 1 is going to have 2 general questions, which are just, do you agree with the goals, and do you think that that it achieves the goals? That's where you can have a chance to have a bit more of just a general comment. And then it's got the 7 different objectives that we just ran through before. And for each of those objectives, there's 3 tick boxes and 2 spaces to comment. So this is where the guide will help you with some of the things that you might want to put in those spaces where you can comment. Section 2 is again just 1 tick box, and it's got 2 spots to comment. So again, you can do section 1, or you can do section 2, or you can do both sections. If you've got the time, we recommend you do both sections, because again, it just gives you a bigger variety of ways that you can make responses. And then at the very end, it's going to ask you your area of interest, like are you an organisation or an individual? Again, just answer that according to your details, and then it'll ask for your personal details. So you do actually need to put in your name, your email, if you do belong to not if you belong to an organisation, but if you're representing an organisation, you need to put that in. It does have the added advantage, there's nothing to stop you doing, like if you're Alyssa, you can put in a response on behalf of VKA, and she can make a personal response as well if she wants. So that's the advantage.
About that.
Yeah, so that's the advantage to putting that in. And then there's just a privacy question about, do you give permission for this to go on public record with your name or not? And again, there's no advantage one way or the other, whatever suits you. If you want your name kept out of it, fine. If you're happy for your name to be published on there, it won't publish your email, by the way, but if you're happy for your name to go on a comment you may have made, then choose that. So I sort of ran through, this is just a copy paste of one of the pages, so you can sort of see what it looks like. So this is out of section 1. This lists what objective 1 is. Is it being met? Well, no, because we don't think we don't think killing kangaroos is sustainable. Are the requirements appropriate? Well, no, because there's no sustainable way to kill kangaroos. And then this is where you get the chance to talk about what other requirements might be needed. Again, another tick box, no. And then this is your second spot where you can actually make comments. Now the spots look really small. You can actually, there's no word limit. We have confirmed that. So you can write as much as you want, or as little as you want, whatever works for you. The only thing I would recommend is write your responses in a separate document, and then when you're done, then copy and paste them in. I don't know specifically with this consultation, but I know when there've been others like this, people have written straight in there and then something's glitched with their computer and then it's lost all their responses. There's no sort of like save function along the way. So that's been really frustrating for people. So you're much better off just, whatever is your normal method of writing stuff, whether it's like Word, Google Docs, whatever, write what you want in there and then just copy and paste it into the survey at the end, because you'll probably be very glad. And as I said, so this is the first space is the one where you can talk about requirements, and then the second one is when you can talk about the targets. If you actually want to go through and read the document, the link to the KHMP is on that Engage site, and so you can see exactly what those requirements and targets are. But if you read through our guide, you'll see that we've broken down and made comments under each of those headings as to, what are some of the requirements that should be in there that aren't, and what are some of the targets that should be in there that aren't. So up to you whether you read the actual document or not. So onto what are you actually going to say in these tiny little squares. I'm going to throw to Alyssa and let her describe the first one.
Yeah, okay. So the first two, as Nat was saying, the first two questions are quite general, so you don't need to worry so much about requirements and targets here. So if you're not really wanting to go into all that, you can always just answer these questions and then skip through all the objectives if you wish. It is great if you want to answer them all, but even if you answer these two at the start of section 1 and then the ones in section 2, that's great, and just check no on all the check boxes. That's an awesome option. So essentially, do you agree with the goal of the KHP? The goal is to provide for the sustainable use of kangaroos in a way that protects animal welfare. The goal makes it clear that sustainable kangaroo populations and good animal welfare outcomes are the highest priorities. So, I mean, some of this statement is one of the other reasons why we suggested just skipping the ranking, because they've already put animal welfare and sustainability at the top, and the rest are all relatively benign. And doing that ranking can sort of seem a little bit like you approve of it. I don't know, but it's totally up to you. I'm not going to do it personally because I just don't like any of their goals, and I don't think any of them deserve a rank. But yeah, so that's the goal. So this is your chance to just say, no, I do not agree with the goal. And that you can say, this is where I fundamentally disagree with the commercial exploitation of wildlife. We've put in a whole heap of suggestions of the sorts of things you can mention here. You can be pretty broad. You can mention that you find it a national embarrassment, that we're contributing to the world's largest wildlife trade, that there's no sustainable number of kangaroos that can be killed. We don't even know how many there are in any sort of reliable way, that we're killing them faster than they can reproduce. We don't know the long-term effects on the ecosystem and biodiversity. We don't know the long-term effects on the species of taking out what we're effectively doing is artificial selection. So the commercial industry is selecting for the biggest and strongest adults. And we don't know what the outcome of that will be in the long term. So it could potentially be a species threatening process that we've just been chipping away at all these decades, and we just don't know the outcome of that. The cruelty to joeys is obviously not prioritising animal welfare. Same with obviously leaving animals wounded and leaving wildlife rescuers to clean up the mess. And the fact that it simply cannot be adequately regulated or monitored, and compliance is impossible. So there's sort of a really broad range of things that you can talk about, and we've given you lots of hints there of stuff that you might like to add. As Nat was saying, it's really important to try and put that into your own words. You can just pick a couple of things, or you can pick a whole range of things that you don't like and stick it all in. This is your chance to have your say. So yeah, I think that's all for that one.
Yeah. So following on from that, the second general question, some of which you've really covered there too, is so do we think it achieves the goal? Well, no, it doesn't. All it's doing is enabling a cruel and unsustainable industry, basically. I think to even pretend that that this program is potentially sustainable, or that it actually is caring about animal welfare, I don't see how you can say that killing animals for commercial profit is in any way about animal welfare. So again, you can kind of go to town on these two questions. This is your chance to just say what you want. So as Alyssa was saying before about the pet food trial, well, the results of that said that it was an unsustainable program, and instead of stopping it, they expanded it. So clear evidence that it's not achieving the sustainability goal. The impact of killing patch and at-foot joeys, again, there's no way that is animal welfare. And the regulation of this entire process is pretty much non-existent. So it's left to volunteers to gather evidence of cruelty, and it's just residents and wildlife carers and wildlife rescuers who are just mopping up after this entire industry. And so again, that is not sustainable. And there's a few other options we've put in there too, but you'll find that there's three sort of main themes that are going to keep coming up, because they really come under all of the headings. So one, is about the lack of accurate data or the lack of accurate numbers that we have of kangaroos. 2 is about the cruelty, particularly towards joeys. And 3 is just that the regulation, enforcement, compliance, all of those, basically regulatory oversight is non-existent. And so those 3 themes are going to come up in a variety of ways throughout this.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you've gotten through that that section and you want to work on each of the objectives, we'll just run through some of what those objectives are and some of the points that we've made for them. And again, the objectives, when you're doing those sections, you just always click no, they're not meeting the objectives, and then you need to put it, the first section in the format it's asking for requirements, and the second text box is asking for what targets there should be. And so me and Nat have spent a very long time going through all the different points and wording it in such a way that it's either a requirement or a target to hopefully give you a good idea of how you can do something similar with yours. Because it's like, it's very easy just to sort of go, this is awful, but you've got to sort of play their game a little bit and think about like I'll work through it. You'll see what we mean. So in terms of sustainability, it's a lot of what Nat was just saying in terms of that we have no reliable methods of accurately gauging kangaroo abundance. At the moment, it's all done on extrapolating data from small aerial transects. And it year on year comes up with these, spits out biologically impossible numbers, which don't take into account any other causes of mortality or about particularly things like natural disasters. We've had some really terrible natural disasters in the last few years that have significantly impacted wildlife. And yeah, it just basically they say, oh no, it doesn't really matter. Kangaroos are still increasing somehow. It's like, don't ask me where they are, but oh yeah, they have no description of, so they say that as part of the Kangaroo Harvest Management Plan that they have a trigger in place for where they will stop killing kangaroos when they're affected by a natural disaster. They don't have the criteria for what that trigger is. That trigger is not really utilised. They did briefly stop killing after Black Saturday in like a couple of zones, but they then will, after they decide to bring it back in, it goes straight back up to the full quota. So essentially there's no real protection there for kangaroos that are affected by natural disaster. They also completely ignored all the calls for a moratorium following the floods. And, you know, Wildlife Victoria, they pushed really hard for a moratorium. They didn't get it. So obviously the triggers aren't working. As I mentioned, again, there's no long-term studies on the impacts to kangaroo families and the way that their mob structure works, and, you know, we're essentially slowly tanking the species by artificial selection. There's just a heap of points that we go through. I might not read through them all because it might take too long. What do you think, Nat? There's a lot here, but essentially,
I think the sustainability and welfare, because I think they're the 2 most important things, is probably worth reading through them, and then for the others, we'll go through them a bit faster, maybe.
Okay, sure. Let's see where we're up to. Oh yeah, so the KHMP specifically states that we must ensure viable populations of kangaroos are maintained within their range, but there's actually nothing in place at all to guarantee that, because the way that the system works is the shooter gets tags and then the landholder books the shooters. So there could be a whole group of landholders that all book shooters with tags and kill every single last kangaroo in that whole vicinity. There's nothing to stop that from happening. And I don't know, like any of you who spend time driving through regional Vic might find that there's places where you see no kangaroos alive or dead anymore. And I think that that's largely part of this whole system just completely failing. It's extremely easy to engage a shooter. As I said, they don't have to have any evidence. So at least if they want to apply for a non-commercial permit, they're supposed to be able to prove that there's a problem with the kangaroos and that they've tried something non-lethal. That's also very simplistic, but that's so much more than they have to do for the commercial system. Essentially, they've made it extremely simple for landholders just to quickly book a shooter via the Service Victoria app. Shooter comes out, landholder signs a thing, away you go. That's it. So they're claiming as well that they have a precautionary approach of allowing 10% of the population to be killed. That really needs to be investigated, because on one hand, we have no reliable idea of what the population actually is. So 10% of what they're claiming to be the population may actually be a huge percentage of the actual population. And also kangaroos can only at best, our grey kangaroos can at best increase their population by 10% per year. And so when I say at best, that means ideal climatic conditions and no shooting. So that is essentially never happening in Victoria, that they're going to reproduce by 10% per year. So essentially it's not precautionary on any level, and that really needs to be investigated. Yeah, we've talked about triggers. So there has to be these trigger warnings that are actually going to respond to natural disasters. And yeah, at the moment, there's just nothing for that. So there's no way that communities can ask the government to do a recount in their area. And we've had places like the Mornington Peninsula where they've done a community count, and they found 2,200 kangaroos there, as opposed to the 7,000 kangaroos that the government said that there were on the Mornington Peninsula. And we're quite keen to do more of that sort of citizen science and really try and interrogate what the government's saying, because it just doesn't add up with what you see when you're actually driving around most of Victoria. Like, you can certainly find kangaroos in pockets, particularly in the peri-urban areas, but there's, you know, the sorts of numbers that they're claiming are just wildly inaccurate. So let's see, there's also and yeah, the impacts as well of having shooting in those sort of peri-urban zones, which is really where kangaroos are seeking refuge these days, because they've been so intensively persecuted on farmland. They really are becoming quite associated with human population. So you'll see them, like, I know Nillumbik is one of those places where if you drive through Nillumbik in the evening, you'll often see a fair amount of kangaroos, which is amazing. But there's now shooters in Nillumbik as well, even though it's peri-urban. There's, you know, family homes all over the place there. It's just all little farmlets. So essentially they're being pushed out and killed even in their sort of last remaining refuges. And so stuff like that, we're really risking localized extinction, not to mention terrorizing of the residents. It also says in that, as one of the targets there, it talks about 100% of non-compliance will be investigated, which is just, as we'll talk about compliance more, but that's just completely ridiculous as well. So you can throw that in there too. All right, over to welfare.
Sorry, that's not, nothing's happening.
What happened?
I don't know. Oh, there we go. Okay. So welfare considerations. So just the entire plan or program, the code of practice that they recommend for how joeys and at-foot young should be killed is absolutely disgusting and inhumane. And to the average person, it's quite abhorrent to think that is, you know, not just some sort of someone acting rogue, but that we actually do recommend, you know, bashing their heads in, and that's not only acceptable but recommended. And I think if the average person knew that or understood that, they'd be quite horrified. So I guess this is where you can turn it into a recommendation, is to say that that there should be a recommendation that the welfare is in line with community values, for example. And then that gives you a chance to say why the code of practice is not in line with community values. So I guess that's where you can kind of work within their system, but still have a chance to say what you want to say. The other sort of welfare issues revolve around things like there's orphan joeys who escape and then they just die later because they're too young to be looking after themselves. And again, there's no requirement for shooters to chase after or to find or to track down, and there's no incentive for them to find any joeys that escape. And those also don't get included in any sort of counts. So even when there are counts to say how many kangaroos have been killed, they're not even accurate because they're not including these animals that are escaped. We have literally no idea how many that is. Same with wounded kangaroos. They do have a requirement to do, a single headshot to kill them instantly. But they're shooting in the dark, often in terrible weather, often long distances over sort of, unfamiliar terrain. So how many are actually going to be killed instantly? I mean, we don't know. And again, there's plenty of wounded kangaroos that escape and die in pain at a point later on. And so again, you can talk about there should be some sort of requirement for tracking them down, chasing them down, finding them, and including them in counts. And I'm sorry, I know that talking about this is distressing because obviously what we want is to not have this happen at all. But this is just a way that you can, talk about welfare on their terms and try to get it on their radar, that it's not the way the program runs currently is not at all in line with what good animal welfare is. Also, the code itself and how compliance occurs with it, it's basically self-regulated. There's very little people out there actually checking up on this, and so there's no checks and balances in place. So again, that's another thing that should be a requirement. There should be some way in which this is audited or checked or overseen, because we all know that self-regulation doesn't work, and especially not in this sort of area or industry. Lastly, so from studies in New South Wales, it has shown that about 40% of kangaroos are not killed instantly, which is a huge percentage when you think of what the quotas are. So yeah, I know this is horrible to talk about, but in some places, there is a requirement for the animal to still have their head attached afterwards, and there's no such requirement for kangaroos, which means that there's no evidence of the fact that animal welfare is not being monitored or that it's not being complied with, because that head may not be attached, and so there's nothing to show that. So again, this is probably going to be a point that not many people want to talk about, but it is just further evidence that welfare is just ignored in this entire process. It also talks about wanting to expand wildlife trade. And again, that is not in line with society's values. I don't think most people want there to be more killing and more wildlife trade, and yet that is one of the things they're looking at, is ways to expand wildlife trade into more human kangaroo meat consumption, not just pet food meat consumption, and trade with other countries. So yeah, talking about there being a requirement to meet society's values or community expectations gives you quite a broad range of things to talk about. As a way to be able to monitor that, for example, we could have a requirement that all shooters need to be wearing like a rifle camera or a body camera, and that footage could be available afterwards, or should be available, or must be available to be viewed, and that could be a way of it being audited. Or that it's running in real time, for example, and that it can be looked at by officers who are supposed to be monitoring this. Yeah, there's various other ways in there as well, but I think the the biggest thing to be talking about here is just that code of practice is absolutely abhorrent, and that it's just not okay.
Whoop, how do we end there?
Oh, regulation.
Yeah, and so as well, I was going to say with the targets, so the section says regulations and then targets. For targets, if that's, you can think of, Nat and I have gone through and thought of a heap of different things for everything, but you can just say the only responsible and ethical target or something along these lines is to not be killing kangaroos for profit and to look at better ways of living with kangaroos. And so if you're just sort of not really wanting to go into that, you can just make up your own statement of what you think, that you just don't think that this should be a thing at all, and that the target should be ending wildlife trade, and you can just paste that in all the boxes if you want to. But we have thought of lots of different things like body cams and that, which you would think that they would be doing, but you can have rifle mounted shot cams and stuff like that if they wanted to actually see what shooters are doing there at night. That would be the best way of doing it. Anyway, so regulation. So the next 2 points, they seem sort of similar. So it's regulation and then compliance. But regulation is essentially, that's how the government deals with it. So how the government writes up the paperwork, how they set the authorizations in process, who does what. So there's a little bit of overlap there. But essentially, with regulation, it can't be regulated. So they can there's really very little value to putting in writing what they should and shouldn't do when they can't possibly enforce that in the field or monitor that in the field. So yes, they have written a lot of words, but the words are kind of meaningless if you have absolutely no way of enforcing them, and you're completely reliant on the self-regulation of shooters who are essentially just there for the money. So they can say, yes, all reasonable efforts must be made to find a wounded kangaroo, but A, what constitutes a reasonable effort? And B, what's the incentive for shooters to look for a wounded kangaroo when for them time is money? Wildlife rescuers will spend days and days trying to find wounded kangaroos, and they do that because they love them and they care. And shooters don't have any of that sort of moral obligation, so they just leave them. Yeah, so no infield audits, or virtually no infield audits. It's very few. Like, we're talking a handful of planned inspections that get done every year. And that's, they can maybe tens of thousands of kangaroos killed. And I think out of like 60 plus thousand that were killed last year, there was something like 14 planned inspections or something, like basically nothing. When you consider the number of actual kangaroos being killed. So there's no oversight in the field. There's no requirement for them to report on wounded or orphaned animals, which is a big oversight because that's a huge number. So in Victoria, they do count the number of joeys that are bashed to death, which is something, because other states don't see any value in monitoring that whatsoever. Like New South Wales, that even came up in the inquiry that they should be doing that, and they said, oh no, there's no value. So we do monitor how many, again, it's self-monitored, self-reported, how many joeys are killed, but that's only the ones that are euthanized. And we know that at-foot joeys are rarely euthanized because they're highly mobile and they escape. It may take them a number of weeks to die without their mother, depending on the age that they are. So there's no requirement to note the at-foot joeys that escape or the kangaroos that escape wounded. There's also, again, another example of the fact that things that are written down don't translate to real life, and definitely the licensing system for them. So they say, oh, accredited shooters, licensed professional shooters, all these sorts of words that make you go, oh, it's really regulated, for the average person. But they have a firearm accuracy test. The accuracy test involves placing 5 shots within a small target, but it has to be still daylight conditions that those are done in. So yes, you definitely have to be a skilled shooter to be able to do that. But regardless, it's not representative of conditions in the field. Kangaroo shooters are active at night And they're also definitely active in any weather conditions, wet, windy weather, that sort of thing. So these accuracy tests aren't actually capturing what's going on in the field at all. And the other thing is that they have to do a proficiency, what do you call, like a TAFE course to be a game harvester. But that actually doesn't cover anything to do with the code of practice. So it's more about things like, how do you hang them up, and how do you gut them in the field, and how do you clean your rig, and all this sort of stuff. There's also no joey bashing proficiency test, and the code of practice specifically states that the humaneness of the method of blunt force trauma, so bashing, comes down to the skill and determination of the shooter. So essentially, they are acknowledging that it could be highly inhumane if it's done incorrectly. So if it's done by someone who knows how to do it really quickly and hit the exact right part of the skull to crush the brain, then that joey is going to be out pretty quickly. But there's absolutely no way of knowing whether a shooter knows how to do that correctly or not. They may be pummeling this poor joey for however long, and nobody's going to know. And so again, there's just no way of proving that they know what they're doing or that they're doing the right thing in the field, despite all the paperwork that they must submit. There's also no requirement to have not committed shooting or cruelty offences before, which is a pretty massive oversight.
Thanks. Sorry,
can I just ask something?
Yeah.
What was the last thing you said about the no requirement? What was that, Alyssa? The last thing you said?
It's all in the document, but just that they don't have to prove that they don't have prior offences to do with cruelty.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm on my mobile and I can't really read the words.
No worries, it's all in the document. The document's extremely comprehensive. We got maybe a little carried away.
Maybe.
But it's there to pick and choose. You don't need to use it all or read it all.
So compliance. So this is actually how, not just how it's regulated, but how it's actually being monitored and overseen out in the field. So like many of these sort of activities, you've got a handful of authorised officers. We don't have an exact number, but we're talking literally a handful covering the whole state. And there's no particular requirement. It's not like they, yes, sure, they have their tags for how many kangaroos they can kill, but they don't have to register a site. It's not like people actually know where it's taking place. It's not like authorised officers know, oh, you know, there's going to be a lot of shooting in this particular region. We'd better make sure that we've got officers there to check on it. None of that's happening. So it's occurring in remote areas, in darkness, all across the state, at, you know, any hours of the night. I mean, that's absolutely impossible to try and monitor with a handful of people. You know, they're going to be lucky, you know, even if they actually had even if they wanted to be monitoring it properly, it actually can't be monitored properly. Then they're going to be more lucky if they come across a kangaroo shooter. It's going to be more by sheer accident than by anything else. So it's very difficult to oversee. So here is again where you could write about, and you know, you can go to town a little bit on making up a variety of different requirements or targets that you want to see that you believe would increase compliance. So you could be writing about things like that they do need to register the site where they're going to be shooting and the time that they're going to be shooting, so that it can be checked up on. I know it sort of comes down at the bottom, but I'll just talk about it now, that again, there's no mechanism that lets neighbours or anyone in the area know that shooting will be taking place. So you could just be, you know, living your life normally and suddenly be woken up in the middle of the night to spotlights coming in your window, or hearing gunshots, which can be quite terrifying for people. And you know, there are certainly many stories of people living in regional areas who've had this very thing happen. So again, saying that there should be requirements for, you know, similar to like a planning permit. You know, if you want to expand your building, you have to, you know, put up a notice that says, you know, this is when this is going to be taking place. And, you know, if anyone has any objections, they should be able to, you know, make them, you know, we could be requesting that something similar to that has to happen for this program, so that everybody knows what's happening and when, and so that it also authorised officers can attend and monitor what's actually happening. So that could be your requirement, and then you could say that the target is that 100%, because they really like this 100% figure all throughout. They keep saying 100% of everything will be done and followed up. So you could say a target should be that 100% of kangaroo shoots must have an authorised officer present. Now, is this going to happen? Well, no, it's not. But by saying things like this, what you're getting across to them is that that's the only way that you consider it acceptable for this to take place, or that you would potentially consider it acceptable. So it's letting them know that the program, the way it is now, compared to what you as a member of the public consider to be an acceptable way for it to be run, that gap is just so big. And that's the type of messaging that it really helps to get across. So whereas you might feel a little bit silly or like you're exaggerating by saying something like that, what you're actually doing is sending a really strong message about how unacceptable the program is in its current iteration. Same thing with the data on the number of kangaroos killed. Well, there's absolutely no way to check the accuracy of that. I mean, someone could come back and say, I killed one joey and they killed 100, or it could be I killed one joey and actually they injured 10 and killed none. Like, there's absolutely nothing to check up on this. So trying to say that there should be, again, the cameras or some way of it being monitored, that should be a requirement, again, sends the message that that's the only way that this is acceptable. Again, community perception does not match, because as Alyssa pointed out, people really think this is regulated. They think that this is a highly regulated activity, that the shooters are not only skilled, but that they've really undertaken some sort of training that is, that means that there is very little cruelty in this, and it's the exact opposite that's true. One of the targets that they've put in there is saying that 100% of responses will be investigated and actioned. It's absolutely impossible, because I'm sure that whatever mechanism they have for reporting, it's not going to be staffed 24/7. It'll be staffed business hours, which means that, so something terrible, you wake up to shooting outside your window, you wake up to shots and spotlights, you wake up and find bits of kangaroos outside your window. If you report it, well, you can't do that till 9 a.m. the next day. So how are you going to get evidence of what's actually happening? Like, you're going to report it and the police are going to say, well, not the police, whatever is their reporting process, they're going to say, well, who was it? Well, unless you want to walk outside of your house and try and use some night vision goggles, which of course everybody has at home, to try and get the license plate, and then you want to try and take some video in poor light, and then you want to try and provide evidence of who it was who was doing this, there's no way to follow this up. Mm-hmm. So it's great for them to say, well, like it looks good on paper. If you don't understand the context, it looks good for them to say 100% of responses will be investigated, but the investigation is going to consist of them saying, do you know who it was? And the landowner is going to say no. Well, that's the end of the investigation under its current format. So you could talk about wanting to have that there should be a 24/7. They've got a name for it, but like a community feedback center or something. That should be staffed 24/7, and not just with people who are taking the complaints, but with enough enough authorised officers that they can actually attend on site when these complaints are made. Now, again, you're going to need hundreds of staff. Like, it's totally unrealistic that it will take place. But it's sending this message between that's the only way you consider it acceptable for this program to take place, and it lets them know how far short they're falling of society's expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the other things that that's been mentioned here by Stephanie is about how it doesn't go to the conservation regulator, and it just reminded me of the fact that something else that we did mention in there is how they've made it exceptionally confusing to try and get anything. Like, if you do put in a complaint, You just get pinged from department to department to department. Actually, I think we do go into that somewhere, don't we?
Number 6.
Oh, sorry. There you go. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll wait and go into that later. All right. Adaptive management and research. So adaptive management is essentially, we don't know what we're doing, but we're going to learn as we go. So it's a nice way of saying they don't have a clue and they're just going to figure it out as they go along. So we're saying that there should be evidence that the community actually supports spending taxpayer dollars on adaptive management research, because the idea is that they go, we don't know even how many kangaroos there are. We don't really know if any of this is going to work. So we're just going to keep running reports and, we'll do some research and, keep pumping all that out, which all costs money. Like they're paying, high-level government employees and academics to do this sort of work. But there really needs to be some sort of indication that the community actually wants their money being contributed into this sort of activities, especially for something that's actually having a really negative impact on a lot of community members, both through community health issues to do with kangaroo meat and wildlife trade, as well as destroying their amenity, our natural heritage, our international reputation, all of that sort of thing. So there's really, at the moment, the data collection that they do is totally inadequate in any case. They don't know how many kangaroos there are. They're just extrapolating. So they're wasting money on data that's insufficient. There's no explanation on how they're going to implement any changes that they do bring in. So if they do find out through the course of this adaptive management that something needs to change, the current KHMP has nothing in there on how those changes are going to be communicated to shooters, stakeholders, and the public, anything like that, and how we know that they're actually going to be complied with. Even things like recently they changed the minister involved, and I don't know how they expect people to know that. Anyway, and yeah, there's no explanation for how the research opportunities they're bringing up are going to be evaluated and who decides on what money should be spent on, which means that they could essentially just be participating in biased and self-serving research opportunities to try and further their own interests, which the government has a financial stake in the kangaroo industry. So it's quite concerning. We urgently need an independent review into their methodology for surveying kangaroo abundance, because the survey figures just keep on being incongruous with community observations and usually biologically impossible, which might be a good point just to mention what Mike Fury's said. And so something that he's done really well is he's gone to the Victorian Auditor General Officer, and you can request an audit there to look at the KHP survey methodology. Because of how flawed it is. So we're sort of thinking if people want to go there to the Victorian Auditor General's office and say, you should be looking at this, that would be really good, because, yeah, it urgently needs to happen. And, of course, as we've been saying as well, that the best target that they could come up with here is to use this money to focus on respectful coexistence with wildlife and ecotourism and things that are going to benefit wildlife and humans and the economy, rather than a dying and dirty, diseased, cruel, unsustainable wildlife trade. Yeah.
So as you started to say, they have this objective to be accountable and transparent in their actions and in the way the whole plan is run, which is basically impossible. For one thing, it is divided between many departments and different authorities, and so it's very different. It's very difficult to get any data. Like any time that people make inquiries about this plan or this program, yeah, you just get sort of shunted from department to department. No one seems to take responsibility, or everyone pings someone else as being the one in charge, but then suddenly they're not. It's all designed to basically just put people off, but also it genuinely is just a badly designed program that is run between multiple different departments, none of whom speak to each other, or not in the way that they should. So complaints just kind of get lost. Requests for info just kind of get lost. Yeah, it's certainly not set up to be transparent. When there are any reports or any sort of studies, the results are very slow to be published, if they're published at all, and then requests to follow them up again just kind of fall into this like abyss, never to be heard of again. So it's all very well to say that we have an objective to be transparent, but the reality of what actually occurs is very far from that. Another area, for example, it says that they're going to be transparent about the number of kangaroos killed under this program combined with the ATCWs. Again, that's impossible because there doesn't exist accurate data on how many animals are killed under ATCWs. There is once a year they release the figures about how many they've given permits to be killed, but again there's no checks and balances in that process. So a landowner might be given a permit to kill or have killed 200 kangaroos on their property because there's 200 that are a pest, but there's nothing to say, there's no checking up, or there's no follow-up to check whether they actually killed 100 or whether they killed 1,000. So you can't be transparent about data that doesn't even exist because it's not collected in the first place. And yeah, just to give an example of who actually oversees this, it's the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, or DECA, the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industry and Regions, 3 different ministers, the Game Management Authority, Services Victoria, Prime Safe and Victoria Police. So if you think trying to get information out of all of those or any of those is easy, it's definitely not. So again, this is just paying lip service to this concept of accountability and transparency. Again, there's even for neighbours or landowners who might suspect that there is going to be shooting taking place near them, if they try to get information to find out has a shooter been issued tags in this area, even that sort of information is not able to be obtained by people. So this creates a lot of issues around human safety. Imagine not even being able to find out whether someone is planning to be shooting near your property. Again, if they're genuinely serious about transparency and accountability, the community contact centre, that's what it's called, it would need to be open 24/7, and they would need to have the ability to respond in real time. And despite the fact that this entire program is really just about commercial killing, it's about money, it's about finances, it tries to set itself up as being about a way of managing kangaroo populations. So even the very purpose for this entire program, they don't even admit. They try to say it's about managing populations. Kangaroos don't need to be managed. Kangaroos manage themselves just fine when when humans leave them alone. So the very title, the very purpose for this in all their documentation is already lacking in transparency. So again, a requirement that you could raise would be something like that there should be mandatory consultation and approval from neighbouring properties before a shoot is allowed to take place, or that the community contact centre needs to be open 24/7. And again, this is where they talk about that wildlife trade management plan about expanding wildlife trade. So saying that that's not, if you want to talk about the fact that expanding wildlife trade is not in line with society values, then you can raise that there should be a requirement or a target that any actions under this are in line with community values, because that certainly isn't.
Okay, so they also, one of their goals is to consult with traditional owners and give them opportunities to partake. we're saying that there should be a requirement to avoid causing cultural offence to traditional owners. And of course, because kangaroos are creator spirits and sacred totem to many First Nations people, they are actually causing deep offence to many people. Not all of them, and it's important to acknowledge that First Nations people hold a variety of views. Some are involved in the kangaroo industry. I believe that it's one of those things that is way overplayed, that people try and say, oh, the kangaroo industry is great because it employs First Nations people. From everything I've seen, the actual percentage of Aboriginal people involved in the kangaroo trade is minimal, but they certainly are some. So there is a variety of views, but what we find is that the views of those who oppose it as culturally offensive or as a continuation of colonial exploitation, that their views are conveniently ignored, and their views should be recognised and respected and afforded the same consideration as those who are happy to partake in the trade. There's also, probably many of you who are advocates have heard but Aboriginal people have been killing kangaroos for 60,000 years, which is true for people who don't have them as totem. Obviously, people who have them as totem don't kill or eat them. But they have been traditionally a source of food and fabric and all that sort of stuff for many tens of thousands of years. And the rights for First Nations people to do that continues under the Native Title Act for traditional purposes. This should in no way be conflated with the kangaroo harvesting program or any of the commercial kangaroo industries in the various states, because there's absolutely no comparison between traditional subsistence use and the world's largest wildlife trade, which is purely for profit and for convenience. And it's quite abhorrent to try and conflate the two. So they're claiming about offering them opportunities for participation, and we're suggesting why not look at other ways that we can celebrate First Nations knowledge of kangaroos, looking at opportunities for ecotourism, cultural education, walks and talks, wildlife tours, all those sorts of things. Why are we only looking at how to involve them with the killing of our natural assets instead of how we can all appreciate and learn? I also find it interesting that they say that they're consulting traditional owners, but there's nowhere that they say who they have consulted or what they actually thought or any sort of approbation for the program. So we think, as a target, we should say that they should be providing, or as a requirement, they should be providing a publicly available registry of the organisations that they've contacted, and that they should have to provide evidence that they've given those organisations a fair and balanced view of the situation, including raising the inherent welfare, sustainability and hygiene concerns, as well as the concerns of other First Nations activists opposed to the kangaroo industry. So things like the UN Declaration for Kangaroos, which if anyone hasn't read that, it's on the Kangaroos Alive webpage, and I strongly suggest having a read. So so that's sort of what we've done for that section.
So that's really the end of section 1. So that's where you've been able to comment on each of those 7 objectives. Section 2 is, so what you can see on the screen, that is basically all of it. So again, you could choose just to comment on section 2, or as we said at the start, you could do section 1 and just talk in that general section and just do no for your tick boxes. But if you are going to do section 2, well, are the existing objectives sufficient? Well, no. Because again, there is absolutely no way that killing kangaroos for profit is in any way sustainable or about animal welfare. So that's a simple no, say, from all of us. But again, you've got 2 more sort of general, spaces to just make comments. So are there additional objectives not currently captured? So, we've just made 2 suggestions about, ban the shameful exploitation of ancient totemic keystone kangaroos that are essential to our country and culture. Well, that should absolutely be an objective. And if that was an objective, then the entire program would be shut down. or replacing slaughter with active investment in respectful coexistence strategies, because that's really what we should be aiming for in every area, is peaceful coexistence with wildlife and with the world around us, and not just trying to find new ways to profit off them or to kill more and more animals. And any final comments? Well, then, anything you want to say here. There's you don't have to phrase it in a certain way or fit into any sort of requirement or target frameworks here. Here you can just I guess this is just your chance to really say something that you want to say. But at the end of the day, the commercial kangaroo killing industry is cruel, dirty, and unsustainable, and it is really unacceptable, not just to animal people who might be here today, but the reality of it is I believe unacceptable to the general person out there if they actually knew what was going on. Again, we can talk about with all the campaigns that have been going on in the US with not wanting kangaroos and not shoes, with those sorts of campaigns as well. It's on par with how we campaigned against whaling for certain countries, etc. It's really seen as quite a national disgrace that we are killing kangaroos. This is it's international condemnation for what's occurring. So you can talk about any of that kind of stuff in this area. Did you want to do a quick conclusion, or shall I?
No, you're right.
Cool.
Yep.
So there's probably been a bit of information in here, and I'm sorry again for the fact that some of it was probably a bit distressing to listen to. Believe me, it's terrible for us to talk about as well. But if you're still here with us, please take away the message that doing something is always better than doing nothing. So even if you feel like you don't want to write a whole bunch about a lot of those sections, or if it's just all too big and hard, again, just going into section 1 and just saying that you don't approve of the commercial kangaroo killing industry, full stop, is already doing something. So please do something rather than doing nothing. And again, please share this with as many people as you can. Use the guide. I said I know it's long, but it is quite spread out, and it does give you some of the things that we've talked about tonight, but it's got other points in there as well, so you can pick something that really speaks to you or that's meaningful to you. Again, those three sort of main points is really what it all comes down to. There's a lack of data. The welfare issues are just inherent in the entire process. There's a lack of oversight and the disrespect to, or the potential disrespect to First Nations people. If you're talking about any of those things, that's got to be sending a very powerful message that we don't want this program to go ahead. And if you need any further help, please feel free to email us, even if feels like a silly question, or even if it's just something you're a little bit unsure of. My email's there, Alyssa's email is there. We will be keeping an eye on it and responding to you because this is due next Tuesday. So you've got 7 days to get this in. And as I said, they're not going to give any extensions for any reason, or they haven't shown any inkling of wanting to do so far. So, we are here to help.